We're very excited and grateful to have Abdur Rahman Elliott Bazzano with us today. Abdur Rahman Elliott is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Moyne College in upstate New York, where he teaches courses on Islam and comparative religion. He took hand with Sidi at the end of high school, and that had no small impact on his career trajectory. His academic research focuses on the interplay of Qur'anic interpretation, polemics, and mysticism, as well as pedagogy in religious studies. His articles have appeared in the Journal of American Academy of Religion, Teaching Theology and Religion, and Religion Compass. He writes for the Wabash Center blog, Teaching Islam, and hosts podcasts for New Books in Islamic Studies. He also serves as co-chair for the Study of Islam unit for the American Academy of Religion. He is the co-editor and co-author of Varieties of American Sufism, Islam, Sufi Orders, and Authority in a Time of Transition, recently published by SUNY Press. His teaching today is Varieties of Sufism in America, Autobiographical and Scholarly Reflections. Abdur Rahman, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So, yeah, a book that I helped write was just published. And so Rahima very kindly invited me to chat with y'all about that and share a little bit about my experience being on the path and how it's led to writing a book about my experience on the path. So what I would like to talk about today is I'll share some autobiographical details about how I am where I am, and then along the way I'll share a little bit about my travels, and then I'll raise some questions that are raised in the book that are probably things that you all have spent a considerable amount of time thinking about as well, such as what is the relationship between Sufism and Islam, what is the importance of authority and personal experience, things like this. So I think it will naturally lead to discussion, and I'm excited to chat with you about these different topics. So I met Sidi around 1999. I was in Northern California. I worked at a health food store about 30 minutes from the land in Pope Valley. And there were 3 people that had moved out there recently to go to healing school. And so I got interested, and they were fun to talk to, and we drank smoothies together. And they're like, my teacher from Jerusalem is going to come to the middle of nowhere in Pope Valley. And so I was like, wow, that sounds fascinating. And yeah, I went and met Sidi, and it was super surreal and strange. And I fell into this like hypnotic sleep state, listening to him talk about the prophets. And I think I left that first lecture just being like, whoa, something just happened. And then I think it was about a year later, I started attending Vickers at the land more regularly. And then a matter of time after that until I took hand with Sidi. And then I ended up going to the healing school. It had recently, it was no longer the School of Energy Mastery, but it was shortly after that transition. And Rahima was in my class, and that was lots of fun. Went to college in Northern California, where I started. So I took hand with Sidi in 2001, and then started college a few months later and became a religious studies major. I did not know that was an option when I started college. So taking hand with Sidi and then starting to study all sorts of religions in college went kind of hand in hand. So when I think about my academic and my non-academic interest in religion, spirituality, Sufism, it's hard to separate sometimes because it all began in similar circumstances. So during college, I also lived at the land and did all sorts of odd jobs for 4 different summers. That was wonderful. Highlights of my 20s for sure, living there and being with all sorts of lovely people and whatnot. And also when I was in college, since we're talking about different kinds of Sufism, some of you may be familiar with Sufi Dancing or the Dances of Universal Peace, inspired by Hazrat Inayat Khan, who I'll talk about later. And that's something I went to, you could say casually, in college. And so I was able to experience a form of Sufism as well that is tied less formally to Islam per se. More on that later as well. Then I spent a year at the University of Hawaii studying abroad, and incidentally, I lived above a mosque in Honolulu with international people. That was a fascinating experience. Then I went to grad school in North Carolina, did my master's degree in religious studies, and went to Morocco in 2006. So that was the first time I left the country, and more on that as well. So here I am at the tomb of Ibn Mashich in northern Morocco, which, if I look kind of grumpy, probably a friend, colleague, and I, we took an all-night bus to the town of Tangier, which is about another 2-hour taxi ride from the tomb. And we arrived, and there was something going on in the town, and no hotels were available, so we did not sleep what we had planned on. But I guess those kinds of things make these stories more memorable. So if we had gotten sleep that night, I might not remember the story as much. And then there's the lovely kind of iconic tree where the Mashich is buried, and we stayed there and did some zikr with the different visitors for a while before heading back. And we had gone there to study Arabic for the summer. So then I went on to get my PhD at UC Santa Barbara in religious studies, Islamic studies, and got to travel some more in the coming years in Yemen, Egypt, Syria, and a short trip to Palestine and Israel. So here's a picture from when I was in Yemen studying Arabic in 2007, and it's just a cute picture with kids. You'll see that's a theme in this presentation. But kids are also very happy, my experience in Yemen, to practice Arabic with exotic foreign Americans. So it wasn't just cute pictures. I got real conversational practice with kids all over the country. We got to travel a bit, and that was a lot of fun as well. I dreamt in Arabic for the first time in Yemen, which was a magical experience. So here I am with my Mormon roommate in Egypt. And so I was in Egypt and Syria studying Arabic full-time in 2009 and 10. And yeah, having a Mormon roommate just kind of made it more interesting. So it was an interfaith experience living in Egypt. And there we are taking a silly picture by the pyramids. But it was really cool. He would do his Mormon prayers in Arabic every night before I went to sleep. And we mostly talked in Arabic in the apartment as well. So for living with a white American, it was still a good kind of immersive, experience with another culture, you could say. Then there's me outside the Dome of the Rock. So I have a short anecdote I'll share about meeting Sidi unplanned in Jerusalem in 2010. So this Arabic program I was in came to a conclusion in June in 2010. I had about 10 days before I went back to the States. And so my friend and I, who happens to be a conservative Jewish guy who I was studying Arabic with, and why he's conservative and Jewish, that will make sense, why that's relevant in a moment. But I asked around if anybody wanted to go on some adventures in these last 10 days before I had to go home. And he was up for it. So my buddy Raphael and I went to the tomb of a Shadhili together outside of Aswan. Also involved a sleepless night of travel. It was a 15-hour train ride from Cairo to Aswan, and then another 4-hour taxi ride to the tomb. And right, that sounds like an adventure. Getting to the tomb, we passed by a checkpoint. We watched the taxi driver bribe the police officer at the checkpoint for about $1. So the bribe did not take much, but that was a fascinating cultural experience. And I wish I had pictures of Shadhili's tomb, but I am unable to locate them at the moment. But just the sheer travel that went on to get there. And then the guy that was like the custodian of the tomb was so nice, and we were the only foreigners visiting that day. But we showed up and he gave us a tour, and he invited us up to his apartment and fed us dinner, and it was a really lovely experience. And going back to get on our train was also another fun experience. This is very brief. but it's just fascinating, so I'll share it. But my buddy wanted to go for a swim in the Nile while we waited for our train to arrive. And so he did, but then the current caught him. He was a strong swimmer. I wasn't so worried, but I couldn't see him. And then some police saw me like sitting conspicuously by the river with a bunch of backpacks, and they're like, "Where's your friend?" That wasn't supposed to come yet. And so I was like, "He's in the river swimming." And then they started to get worried, like maybe reasonably so. And then a bunch of people showed up, and I was talking with a bunch of cops, and then my friend showed up, and everything was fine. But it was part of the memorable tomb experience. So after Egypt and Syria, I came back to the States and graduated. And that's my daughter Hazel, who was born in 2012. And then, yeah, so I finished my PhD program in 2013, and I had another daughter in 2014. And I'm currently in Syracuse, New York, where I work at Moyne College, which is a Catholic Jesuit school, and it's also a liberal arts institution. So I teach courses not just about Islam and Sufism, but comparative stuff as well. So it's kind of come full circle. My interest in religion started out as Sufism and Islam in particular. I went to college and got interested in everything. And now I'm still teaching at a college and interested in everything, as well as Islam and Sufism in particular. So this book that I had the great pleasure of co-editing with Marcia Hermanson, who incidentally is like the founder of the study of Sufism in America. Like if you Google Sufism in America and look for publications, you'll find things by Marcia Hermanson and more things by Marcia Hermanson and by Marcia Hermanson. So this is just like a fantastic coincidence that I was able to write the book with her in particular. So I was in Morocco in 2011 and 12, living with my then wife, who was teaching English, and I was finishing my dissertation and could be anywhere. So Morocco was a fine place to be. And we were affiliated with a cultural center there, and Marcia just happened to be in town to give a talk on Sufism in America. So I attended, and I got to meet her, and that was really cool, since I was already aware of her and her work, and I think I had emailed her about research previously. And then, yeah, you know, we probably exchanged information, and then I didn't see her for a little while, and then randomly, I was in Chicago visiting some friends during Ramadan, I think like a year later. And these friends that I was visiting and Marcia is based in Chicago as well, so they invited Marcia over as well. So we got to reacquaint ourselves. And then I think at some point, the end of the evening, I was asking her if she had any plans to write a book on the subject, because she had written so many articles on Sufism in America. And then she was like, "Yeah, you know, I've thought about it, but writing a book is like a lot of work. It would be really helpful if there was someone to like help with it." So she's like, "Do you want to write a book about Sufism in America with me?" I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great." So it happened. So that was sort of the beginning of it. And so then I got to do some formal interviews with some of Sidi's students, including Rahima Sherrill, who was kind enough to do that. And then some also interviews with people who didn't want their names to appear. And so I made up names for them. And you could take your best guess if you read through the chapter. And I'll also comment about the book. Right now, it's only available in hardcover, and it's kind of unreasonably expensive. It's like $95. But I could encourage you to ask local libraries to purchase it. That makes it accessible. They're usually happy to do that. And then also in January, it should be available in paperback for like $25 or $30, hopefully something more reasonable. So a little bit about the authors that contributed to the book. Also, those are my kids, just because. So the authors, some of them talk about their explicit relationships to the tariqas that they study, others don't. I'm not explicit in the chapter, but I think people can get the hint that I definitely have some personal connections to the order in various ways. And roughly speaking, the orders that we look at in the book could be divided up into these two terms that we could call perennials and hybrids. And so perennials would be more along the lines of universal Sufism, so things that might be less tied to formal Islamic practices, but still probably are somewhat related. And then there's hybrid orders, which are American and have certain kinds of American characteristics, but nonetheless clearly draw from explicitly Islamic practices and have sheikhs that may come from the Muslim majority world and also have ties to students in the Muslim majority world. And so I would think our tariqa is kind of in the middle of that area, leaning more towards the hybrid model, but that's one thing we can discuss towards the end of this presentation. And the author chapters come from different backgrounds. Some of them are Muslim, some of them, quite honestly, I'm not sure, but everyone that contributed to the volume are people that have research specialties in Western Sufism or Sufism in America specifically. So I'm super honored that we were able to have the group of people in the volume that we do. And a few of them have written monographs on Sufism in America as well. So it's definitely a volume written by experts. And again, super lucky to have taken part in the project. And incidentally, Melinda Crocus, who wrote this article about the Qadri Rafai Tariqa. So Sheikh Tanner used to live in Napa, like an hour away from the land. And I've interacted with him a little bit just because of that proximity and know more or less about some of the other chapters. Aside from having read them, I read them all like multiple times. But there were still mistakes in my chapter. But even when you read things 10 times, it's hard to catch all the errors. Okay, so let's look at some thematic issues that we look at in the book, and then we can open things up to Q&A and discussion. So just think to yourselves, is this the question that you've ever thought about before? When do you think about it? How often do you think about it? Why do you think about it? You can tell I like questions. So why is this even a question? And so me as a student of Sidi's and also as someone that thinks about this from, we could say, an academic standpoint, I've definitely gone through phases about what kind of question this is. I think for me personally, when I took hand with Sidi, I knew a lot about Sufism and was like, all right, so we're Muslims, yeah, Islam, like something to do with Muhammad, it means surrender. I like to do dhikr, that's powerful. So I was definitely working through this question from my early days. And then, you know, reading Sidi's books and getting into discussions, even debates with students of Sidi's, I learned that this is a complicated question. And I still think that very much. I don't think it's so simple. And one of the ways I was really impressed editing this book was one of the chapters about the Golden Sufi Center is about one of these tariqas that we could call the perennial or universal Sufi orders. Explicitly does not, you know, observe Ramadan in a traditional sense or observe the 5 pillars, but there are things like student-teacher relationships and the silsila and different kinds of dhikr practices connected to Naqshbandis and Chishtis who are traditional Sufi orders. And this universal Sufi order embraces these practices. So I think to make a sharp distinction between something like Islamic Sufism and non-Islamic Sufism isn't so easy. And I think that's true even within our order. And I say that based on just conversations I've had with people in terms of how they understand being connected to Sidi versus, or the order or the community versus, you know, feeling connected to the Quran or the 5 pillars or what have you. And so there's different terms we can come up with. Non-Islamic is kind of a diplomatic way to say it, but then, you know, what if we say un-Islamic? Then that makes it sound different. Maybe it's like bad or opposite of Islam, or quasi-Islamic, like maybe it's a little bit Islamic. Stephen Colbert coined a nice term, Islam-esque. But, you know, these are terms and they're not easy to pin things down, right? Like, I think a pretty clear theme from reading Sidi's books and being around Sidi and people in our tariqa is that it's hard to put ultimate experiences of God into a box. So some themes that all of the chapters in this edited volume look at are issues of gender, issues of authority, and issues of spiritual practices. And I think those three categories are some helpful ways to think about these categories, broadly speaking, called Islam and Sufism. And people come up with these different distinctions for a reason. We might be familiar with this early saying that's from about the 9th century, that Sufism used to be a reality without a name, and that now it's become a name without a reality. And this wasn't in the 21st century, this was like 1,000 years ago. So very early on, amongst Muslims, there is this idea that there's this invisible or unspoken reality, and then what happens when you have to give it a name? What do you lose by giving something a name? So, you know, the relationship between Sufism and Islam, this is not particular to America, but in America, we can think of certain kinds of ways that Sufism and Islam do become particular. You know, do we call it Islamic Sufism in America, or Sufism in America, or American Sufism? And these all hint at different aspects. So I raised these terms hybrids and perennials, which my co-editor Marcia Hermanson formally introduces in her various publications. And I think it's a fun terminology also because it raises the issue of flowers, right? In flowers, you have hybrids and perennials. And so, you know, they might smell differently, they come across at different types of the year, they look differently, and they're both connected to the earth and show up in different sort of ways. So it's a nice little natural metaphorical analogy to think about. So technically, the way most scholars would say Sufism came to America was through Hazrat Inayat Khan in 1910 or 1911. And he came from India. He was a Sufi Muslim musician. He belonged to the Chishti Sufi order. And this was basically a mission from his teacher. Now, does anyone have ideas of why we might imagine Sufism came to America much earlier than 1911? So as early as the colonies in the United States, enslaved Africans came to the US as well. And scholars estimate between 10, 20, 25% of these enslaved Africans, many of them from West Africa, would have been Muslim. And as the history of Islam shows us, there's been Sufi Muslims pretty much wherever you find Muslims in general. So even though this may not be documented in writing the same ways, I think there's good reason to imagine that there is a very old tradition of Sufism in the United States that goes as far back as the enslaved Africans, you know, in the 17th century or so. And then if we really want to get into it, if there were Native American prophets, then there could be some sort of Sufism in the Americas going back even further than that. And so I think Hazrat Inayat Khan raises an interesting question that many of us still are grappling with today, which is how do we spread the word? What does it mean to do missionary work for Sufism and Islam? And so for Hazrat Inayat Khan, this was through music. And so in many ways, he's not trying to teach people about the Quran per se, or how to fast, or how to do the 5 pillars, but what does Sufism feel like or look like by playing music? And so, you know, I think so for me personally, hanging out with Sidi and his students in the early days, we did dhikr. This was the practice that attracted me to Islam and Sufism and helps me get in touch with my heart. And certainly music was the way I had experienced God previous to that in any case. So it's not hard for me personally to see music as a form of, you know, missionizing, for lack of a better word. And yeah, how do we tell people about Sufism and share? And that's a Q&A discussion question, you know, we can talk about in a few minutes. So those are my formal remarks. and I hope to open it up to some Q&A and discussion. I'm here just as, someone I can talk about my experience, and it is specialized in certain regards. I have a lot of experience being around college students, some experience traveling the world and hanging out with Muslims and studying Arabic in different countries, and going to Sufi events in Pennsylvania and California within our tariqa, and having the pleasure of speaking places like here. So the last selfless picture of me and my kids, since they, like music and dhikr and prayer, they continue to be a source of inspiration for me, and help me think about the embodied ways that all of these years of practice and meditation and staying up all night doing khalwas, what has this done for my heart? And so in a serious but also silly way, my kids are a big way that I think about what this all means for me personally. And so here are some questions that I have thought of that we could formally look at, but I'm also happy to think about other questions that some of you may be interested in particular. And with that, I will end the formal part of my presentation, and thank you very much for bearing with me so far. So yeah, please share your thoughts. Our moderator can let you know how to do it in your voice or in text or what have you.
Thank you, Abdur Rahman. So if you'd like to make a comment, ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself. If you're on a phone, *6. I think we can do it pretty informally. We've got a group that we can manage that. If you want to raise your hand, that's fine. But if you just want to unmute and speak, do so now. Rahima.
So we hear in many places that Sufism is seen as being, by Muslims, is seen as being backward and witchcraft and from the rural areas and not real and lower caste, if you will, or something. How has your Sufism been received, or do you hide it, or how do you deal with it?
It's a really good question. And I think, it's similar to in the United States. I'll make a rough analogy. You might find similar kinds of experiences if you meet Muslims who may not be familiar with Sufism. And so in this regard, it's often a question of ignorance, not in a good or bad way, but just if you grow up in a, like in America, a lot of people, like Protestants, right? Like, so there's more Catholics in the world than Protestants, but a lot of Protestants grow up in America and are like, oh, Catholics, those aren't real Christians. And it's like, that makes sense if that's the bubble you grow up in, but if you want to think about this word Christianity more broadly, then that's a very, amnesiac kind of perspective. So similarly, people can have strong opinions about Sufism in the Muslim world, about not liking Sufism, for example, and it often has to do with ignorance. But, at the same time, Sufism and dhikr and certain kinds of celebrations of the Prophet's birthday, things like this, they often get associated with what we might think about as folk practices, and you could think about Christianity similar, like you have the main holidays like Easter and Christmas, but then in Christianity or in Catholicism or Orthodox Christianity, you might have minor holidays or feasts of saints, things like this, and depending on what parts of the world you're from, these just might seem like totally foreign practices. But like in Morocco, in Fez in particular, there's a Sufi named Ahmed Tijani, and he's kind of like the patron saint of Fez. And Fez is like the cultural capital of Morocco. And so if you live in Fez, then Ahmed Tijani, you would have a hard time being like, yeah, he's shady. I'm going to say, bad things about him in public. But, if you live in some other Muslim country and you've never heard of Ahmed Tijani, then you might be like, yeah, these Sufis, they're encouraging people to do weird things. So that's a complicated question, Rahima. And so being in academia for like the last 20 years one of the things that's done to me is it's made it hard to give concise questions to things. But that's my concise version of my answer. But feel free to follow up if there's more specifics.
So
And maybe I'll say one other thing very briefly because I have it in my head. So I met these two lovely brothers when I was in Yemen. Their names were Muhammad and Ali. And they were just the dearest people. And we just became friends and would hang out on a regular basis and have lots of fun conversations about just Yemeni and American culture and Islam and the meaning of life. It was just so cool. And it was in Arabic, so it made it more fun for me in ways. And they were very patient and they were willing to speak with me in Arabic. So it was a very dear kind of relationship, actually. And I remember after we'd known each other for some time, I think probably because of this concern you're talking about, Rahima, I was aware about this term Sufism and, you know, to use it sparingly. And so I think we got into it at a certain point. And even I mentioned this very famous Sufi, Ghazali, who died in the 12th century. And even like Muslims that might be skeptical about Sufism, if they're educated and they hear this person, Ghazali, who Sidi references frequently in his books, it's kind of like Ghazali was a mainstream guy. So it was interesting. I mentioned to my friends, Muhammad and Ali, like, what about Ghazali? You know, people considered him a Sufi. And then immediately they're like, well, yeah, but why would we have to call him a Sufi? Why can't he just be a Muslim? So, you know, it didn't become hostile or anything, but you could tell it brings up this issue of skepticism, because then it's like the question is like, well, what's wrong with just Islam? So yeah, please continue.
Actually, that sort of answered it, because I wondered if you sort of hid is a little strong, but, you know, held close to you your own Sufism and didn't reveal it necessarily early on. And that sounds like that's what you do, is it's something you hold a bit close and in an appropriate moment get into it. But
yeah, and I imagine all of us have found ways to answer the question, like, so how did you find Islam or Sufism? You know, depending if we're talking with our mom or a conservative, you know, Trump-loving family member, God help us, you know, or what have you. But seriously, right, where we become aware of our audience, and it's like, I think probably for a lot of us, like, yeah, you know, I met these people and we wore dresses and we all held hands and we said, Allah, Allah. And, you know, for some people that's like, wow, cool, tell me more. And other people, they're like, whoa, what are you? So, you know, I don't need, so in that way, I just want to say that I think traveling the Muslim majority world isn't that different in terms of just getting a gauge on who your audience is and what kinds of things they might want to hear about in your personal experience.
and just one last unrelated thing, it suggested that you met Sidi when you were at Dome of the Rock, and you were going to tell us about that?
Yeah, so so in 2000, and this was related to, so my first story where I said I had met Sidi in Pope Valley and I had heard that, you know, he lives in Jerusalem, and this is kind of this enigma. And then I don't know what y'all's experience was, but for me, in the years and years I spent listening to Sidi, I found that the personal anecdotes he would share were really far and few between. And he didn't talk a lot about his personal life. And I always find people's personal lives so fascinating because I think it helps explain so much about how they understand their spirituality. And I think for Sidi, he's on a different level. He gets a pass on that question, fine. But I would still be interested, you know, when he's talking about getting sent to prison and using that opportunity as a way to make dhikr and, you know, do khalwas with his prison mates and things like that. But there was a part of me that was kind of like, you know, is he really a big deal in Jerusalem? He doesn't seem to be talking about it. It certainly seems relevant to his, you know, project in the United States. So it wasn't like that I thought it was a lie, but it was like, you know, it seemed like, why isn't this more obvious? So when I was in Jerusalem in 2010, and I was staying in this hostel near the Dome of the Rock, kind of like wondering, like, you know, will I see him anywhere? You know, so then I was staying there on a Thursday night. And then, yeah, so part of this trip, which I think made just the trip in general interesting, is my friend who I got to agree to go along with me in my Arabic program happened to be a conservative Jewish guy, and he was living in Egypt and he was learning Arabic. So in terms of, you know, breaking down stereotypes, you know, so he fit in his own kinds of complicated boxes as well. And he was pleasant to have conversation with. So he was a good dialogue partner, and he made going to a trip to Jerusalem just always full of good conversation, and we could challenge each other. And he was the one that actually ended up getting held at the border from Egypt to Israel and getting kind of interrogated a little bit, and they let me go through just fine, just as a matter of irony, because he wanted to talk the whole trip about how much he loves Israel and how great their security system is as well. And that's not my perspective as someone who is pretty clearly anti-Zionist and has become increasingly so over the years. So in any case, we still had a good time in Jerusalem together. And so I woke up Friday morning, headed down to the Aqsa Mosque to do Jum'ah, and I hear a voice. And it's like, that voice sounds awfully familiar. Totally sounded like Sidi, but I couldn't see him. It was just, you know, a voice coming from the loudspeaker. Incidentally, here's a fun Arabic word. So the formal Arabic word for phone, most Arabs will call your phone a mobile, right? Like a mobile phone, but the formal word is hatif. And the word hatif in Old Arabic, it means a sound coming from somewhere where you can't hear it. So in any case, this is what was happening. I heard a voice on a loudspeaker with no face. It totally sounded like Sidi. So I walked in, found a seat, but I was far enough back because it was a packed day in the non-pandemic days when you could be in packed social spaces. And I asked the man next to me, I was like, who is this? And he said, it's Sheikh al Jamal. And I was like, I knew it. And so yeah, Sidi was giving like the pre-khutbah talk, and then the khutbah happened by some other sheikh. And then after the Jum'ah was over, I saw Sidi, and I had like, you know, it was kind of like, oh my God, there he is. It was like, you know, so it's like I had taken hand over 10 years ago. It was just kind of a surreal moment seeing him in Jerusalem. And so I went up to him afterwards, you know, I probably kind of like seemed a little weird about it because I was feeling a little bit surreal. I was like, hi, Sidi, like, you know, my name's Abdur Rahman, I know you're from California. And he was pleasant. He was like, you know, bless you, my child, you know, Bismillah. And then I was like, you know, are you free? Could I come visit you in your office later on? He was like, I'm very busy. So I'm like, okay, you know, and I left. So the next day, I asked around, like, where is his office? And, you know, so maybe I was disobeying the sheikh, full disclosure, I don't know. But then I went to go, I found him in his office, and I asked one of his helpers, and they went and got him. And he was very kind and cordial. He's like, welcome. And he invited me to sit down and have some coffee. And I was very conscious of not wanting to overstay my welcome. So I probably stayed there about 5 minutes. And he said, so, you know, he was like, you know, he was happy that I was there studying Arabic. And then what I remember this very clearly, because I don't think I ever heard this phrase ever following that meeting. The last thing after I heard him say, he said, Dir balak min as-sawarikh. And what that means is, and this was not a tumultuous time in particular, but it means watch out for the missiles. So it was like, all right, you know, because I had told him I was traveling there from Egypt to Israel. And so part of me, I say that in somewhat of a lighthearted way, because like Sidi is just intense, of course. But so whatever that means, the missiles of the inner jihad or something more, you know, obvious, I don't know. But I remember him saying that to me, and it terrified me to a degree. But yeah, that was my meeting with Sidi in Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. I'm done. I'm complete. Thank you.
That's a great story. That's a great story. Anybody else has any comments, reflections, questions?
Yeah, Ms. Mukmina, I just wondered if you could enlarge a little on hybrid versus perennial, and why, I think you said Arterica's hybrid in America?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like this isn't So this is a question of terminology, which is hard, right? Like, so if we're going to talk about different kinds of Sufi orders, we want to talk about that Islamic or non-Islamic or un-Islamic or sort of Islamic. And so it depends how I want to think about it. But, you know, I think just my own observation on how our tariqa has developed over the years since I've been a part of it and stories I hear is that it's definitely hybrid, because we definitely take formal Islamic traditional practices seriously as a group, and we have Ramadan retreats, and when we're fasting as a community, this is not to say that there isn't an inner dimension, or even that the inner dimension is not the most important dimension, but it's also to say that we also observe Ramadan as a physical, material fast as well, that it's not just something we think about, that abstaining from food and drink, if we can, is part of Ramadan. And so for some Sufi orders, like the Sufi order that embraces the dance of universal peace, which the chapter on Inayati or Western Sufism, the book, she looks at this group, and they explicitly do not observe Ramadan or ritual prayer as one of their formal Islamic practices. I think in these groups, you will certainly find people that do, but it's not a matter of formal teaching of the Sufi order. So as far as these Sufi orders are concerned, you can very much practice Sufism without being Muslim. And I think for our order, it's more ambiguous. I think on one level, you can say, well, no, you can't practice Sufism without being Muslim, because I think Sidi says things in his books like there is no Sufism without Islam. But still, I think there's a lot of room for interpretation about what it means to practice Islam. Does it mean to surrender to God in your heart? And this is not something that is necessarily visible to people looking in. Or does it mean, you know, to wear special clothes and say words in Arabic? And I say that as a little bit of a caricature, but I mean that there's a spectrum, and people's relationship to spirituality in Islam, I think, you know, is usually a dance in between those two spectrums, so, or two ends of a spectrum. So I'm hesitant to say whether any given orientation is like fully hybrid or fully perennial. But yeah, just the concise version is that hybrid Sufism in America means it formally draws on Islamic traditional practices, and perennial or universal Sufi practices or movements don't necessarily formally draw on Islamic practices, even if they very much are inheritors of some type of Islamic Sufism.
Yeah. Oh, and could you say the name of your book again and say a little more about it, please?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'll bring the picture up also because I think it has some nice cover art. But you can all see this. I'm still sharing my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, so we had the option of some stock photos, and luckily through some channels, through connections of Marcia, in fact, we got it commissioned by an artist in America who has done art for other Sufi projects. His name is Michael Green. And so a little bit more about the book is each chapter looks specifically, the way we decided to organize the book was according to Sufi groups. So we could have looked at themes and then maybe looked at people like Hamza Yusuf, or how different Sufi groups engage with politics or the media or the Mawlid or something like that. But we decided to arrange each chapter according to different groups. And so the different groups that we specifically looked at are worth mentioning because some of them are quite prominent and some of them are less prominent. So the first chapter looks at the Inayati Orders, which there's actually more than one. And so Hazrat Inayat Khan his students and children who became inheritors of the order. So that's fascinating, right? So it's a Sufi order that does not explicitly espouse that you need to follow the 5 pillars, but nonetheless, there's a silsila, or a student-teacher relationship, that the members take very seriously. So that's one way that order does relate to Islam specifically, but not in other ways. So the Golden Sufi Center, similarly, they draw on Islam in various ways, but not necessarily the 5 pillars. And then the Bawa Mujahideen Fellowship. So this is a Sri Lankan man who came to the US in the 70s and did something similar. He attracted a lot of students, although did not necessarily require that they all practice the 5 pillars or read the Quran or things like this. And so his group actually, you find his students are on, there's a spectrum as well. Students that definitely embrace the 5 pillars, students that don't, but nonetheless consider themselves serious students of the group. And him being buried outside of Philadelphia is actually perhaps the most famous Sufi tomb in the United States, which is just some kind of fun trivia as well. And then the Simon Sorgenfrey, he's based in Sweden. He wrote about the Mevlevis of America, which has its origins in Turkey, with based in the order surrounded around Rumi. So in here you find Rumi. He's born in Afghanistan, buried in Turkey, but he wrote in Persian, and so he has American students as well. So one of the things the book does is it looks at the international and transnational components of these groups as well. And that's one of the things I write about in my chapter. I look at sort of the history of our own group in the United States with Sidi and with Nuruddin Durki, as well as to some degree its connections to the Beloveds in the UK, which some of us may know predate Sidi's regular trips to the United States. He had students in the UK for quite some time as well. And then there's a Bosnian Turkey, the Alami Tariqa in upstate New York. And then Melinda's chapter about Sheikh Tanner, who also comes from Turkey and also has an international following. And then Russell Miller looks at a largely African-American group based in New York City who draws on the Tijani order. And so last thing I'll say about the book for now is that, one of the things the book does that separates itself from other volumes on Sufism is it's up to date. It was published this year. But also part of that is that a lot of the field work or ethnographic things that we did in the chapters are relatively recent or fresh. So it's in many ways an up-to-date view on, how different groups are practicing Sufism in America based around different particular groups. So thanks for all your questions. These are great. There's also some questions in the chat window. Pat, are these things that I should look at as well?
No, people were talking back and forth, but Abdullah Koch, I think you might have a question. Why don't you go ahead, Abdullah?
Alaikum. Thank you, Pat.
Alaikum assalam.
And so my question is, so you had, the question is it Sidi's Tariqa hybrid or perennial, or I would add just straight up Islamic? How do you think Sidi would answer that question?
Well, I trepidate to answer how Sidi would answer the question. And in a non-ironic way, I will even say, one of the things that shows up in my interviews in the book is that Sidi might have things to say in his books, and then people might ask Sidi a personal question, and he'll give them an answer about their personal question. And it might seem to have some tension or contradiction with things he says in his books. And I know that anecdotally as well, that he might sometimes have very strong things to say in his books about various social, religious, or political topics. But, you might know people as well that talk to him about these topics and they give him a different take. So that is my big preface, that I have no idea how Sidi would answer this question. But what I do think is that if we read between the lines, I think a lot of takeaways could be that, you know, Sidi is the way that he might enforce, for lack of a better word, things that he thinks. Like, so one sort of strong thing that people have various political and social feelings about would be head coverings. And we could even say head coverings for women in particular. And I know I can think of a small handful of occasions where he might have said things like, I would like the women present to cover their head. And I only remember him saying that, you know, rarely, if at all, in the first several years of me being around him. And in the last several years, if he did ever say things like that, if there was ever some kind of strong or even explicit follow-up, especially in public, where he would single someone out and say something like, you're not dressed appropriately, either I can't remember any instances, or they are so few and idiosyncratic that that's how they are in my head. So that kind of gets at the question around the bush a little bit, but I think it goes to show that he might have a formal opinion or position on something, but even the way that he handles it, I think, you know, he would model a lot of the time that there's a rule, and then there's how you communicate with people in compassionate and merciful and kind ways that, you know, encourage open-heartedness and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know that Sidi would have appreciated these terms of hybrid and perennial, because he would have said, you know, like because, you know, he would say things like Sufism is the real Islam. So I think Sidi was happy to be strong about these terms being interchangeable in certain ways. But my own take from listening to him as well is that, you know, is that every moment can be a chance of remembering God and seeing God in someone. And so how you facilitate an interaction with God, it could happen through the ritual prayer, it could happen with how you smile at someone. And so in that regard, then we're waxing cosmic, as one of my undergrad teachers would say. And as we're all very used to as being students of Sidi's, as waxing cosmic. But yeah, so what does it mean to, you know, be Muslim or Sufi in the moment? I think that's a very big question. So I'll stop saying anything more about that now.
If you don't mind, could I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So just looking at the table of contents of your book, it looks like obviously there are certain groups that you focused on, but I'm wondering about other groups that that you didn't focus on in the book, that were maybe more explicitly Islamic, like you mentioned Hamza Yusuf or Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, or some of the other shuyukh who are associated with Seekers Guidance. Yeah. And I'm wondering why they weren't included in the book, and if you've had conversations with that, you know, with people in those circles, and how that might influence your answer.
So great question. And I will say, so Omar Farooq Abdullah and Hamza Yusuf, some of you, I'm assuming, are familiar with them, some of you may not be, but these are very prominent Sufi sheikhs in the United States. They happen to be white converts and men, and I think there's something to be said about that in terms of the politics of Sufism in America. But of course, you know, not exclusive, but, you know, I think it's not a coincidence that they are that and also influential. So their names show up plenty of times in the book. The reason there aren't individual chapters about them is because neither one of them, as far as I am aware, regularly give initiation into a formal tariqah. And so I'm aware of people that may have relationships with them as certain kinds of formal teachers, but not in the sense of a formal tariqah, sheikh, murid kind of relationship. And then, so Sheikh Nuh Keller, who wrote, you know, translated The Reliance of the Traveler, many of us are familiar with, also part of the story of American Sufism, has written a lot of things about American Sufism, is Shadhili, knows Sidi, knows Abdul Haq Godless, is based in Amman, Jordan, has many students in America and visits America sometimes. So we could have written a chapter about him, and we didn't because I instead mentioned him in the chapter I wrote. And so I was focusing on amongst the various Shadili groups in America, and there are various ones. And so ours is one of them. And so I sort of folded other Shadili groups into how they relate to our group. But yeah, it's a great question. And then another part of it is there's also the Naqshbandi Haqqani order, which was led by Sheikh Nazim out of Cyprus, and now by Sheikh Hisham. And that's a influential Sufi movement in the United States. And so one of our other criterion for what to include in our chapter was things that hadn't been written about or things that hadn't been written about in a while. And there's a few publications about that group. Right? So yeah, it's not a commentary on what we thought was important or less important, but more about what constitutes a Sufi order and what is recent.
Okay. Yeah, I just thought you might get more, the answer to that question of what is Sufism might skew more towards, it is the inner Islam, if you were to ask groups, led by, well, the late Sheikh Nazim now, or Dr. Umar, who, by the way, does have a formal Murid Sheikh relationship in the Qadr of Tariqa.
So in Qadri.
Yes.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
And I can plead ignorance to this as well, but I guess I wonder, since I am aware of his role as a public intellectual and scholar, so I don't doubt you at all. And like I said, I know people that have close relationships with him. But, and yeah, so maybe he could have been someone to include. But I also get the sense that his public role in that capacity may not be so prominent. But again, I don't know. There's plenty I don't know about this topic, certainly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Bismillah, is this also the reason why there's no coverage of the Jarrahis or the followers of Shu'am?
Yes.
I'm probably mispronouncing it right.
Yeah, I forget the name of the volume. So there's two other volumes that, if this volume is of interest to folks, it would probably interest people as well. One of them is called Sufism in North America and Europe, and one called Sufism in the West. And these are both edited volumes. And you can tell both of them have a broader scope than this one, which is looking at America in particular. And so, yeah, there's an article about the Jarrahis in one of those orders. So I think that led us to not focus on that, since there was already in-depth look at them. But yeah, Sheikh Fariha shows up in the index of our book as well. So I think, and I'll say something else, this might be of interest. Yeah, so there's an index in the book. We, as good nerdy academics, we tried to make our footnotes extensive and wide-ranging. And then I would also add that the authors of the book, which you could imagine is somewhat self-selecting, we mostly chose the authors. Marcia and I just emailed people that we knew and said, would you be interested? So it was self-selecting in a lot of ways, but I think I can safely say that 100% of the authors of the book aren't writing about the topic from a totally detached perspective, and that they, even if they're not Sufi or even if they're atheists, I don't know some of the religious affiliations, I think it's clear that everyone in the writing the book is Sufi leaning in some sense or another.
I was surprised you didn't have something by Daniel Pipes in there. Thank you.
Yeah, so Daniel Pipes, you may or may not know, is a notorious Islamophobe. And yeah, so if you want to read stuff by notorious Islamophobes, you can Google Daniel Pipes or watch Fox News, or there's an endless supply. Although on that note, a very quick note, so there's a guy named Robert Spencer, excuse me. Richard Spencer is the white supremacist. So Robert Spencer is a notorious Islamophobe. And so I found an edited volume once, and it was about like Arabic poetry, and it looked legit and not, just like regular academic stuff that only a handful of people read because it's obscure. And one of the authors was Robert Spencer. And I thought, oh my God. So I was like, I'm going to email the authors of this immediately and just make sure they know who this guy is. But no, it just turned out there was some other guy named Robert Spencer who has his PhD in Arabic literature and is not an Islamophobe. So anyways, I don't know about the various Daniel Pikes in the world, but there's at least one who has bad thoughts to think about Islam.
Thanks for explaining.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your questions and for putting up with my dad humor.
Okay, Rahima, you'll have the last question or comment for today.
Oh, just how much I would thank you. Except for outing me, that was probably not. I'm grateful for that one.
Who did I out?
Me.
Okay, I don't remember how I outed you, but
any Rahima.
What's that?
You could have been quoting any Rahima.
Uh-huh. Okay, it's true. There is specific geographical information in there, but again, yeah, I could still be quoting any Rahima.
You could be, yeah,
that.
and probably it wasn't me completely. So.
Yeah. It's a popular name in our tariqa as well.
Yeah, lots of them, so many. One other comment I wanted to make about Islam, because there's this conversation going on about it, is that, so in my history, I spent over 10 years, I was in Egypt about 14 months. And so I was with Muslims all the time. This was before I was on this path, before I knew anything about Sufism. I was closest to a Hago who was just this beloved woman. And in retrospect, she was probably a Sufi as I look at her behavior and what she did. So what I learned in Egypt was that to be Muslim is as various as to be Christian. There are all different ways to practice it. There are all different levels of good Muslim and not so good Muslim. And people who look like good Muslims can be really mean. And people who don't seem to practice too much can have huge open hearts and still want to do the Prophet's birthday. So I learned that Islam is not a singular thing. It's hugely various, and everybody will agree on what the rules are. But if you ask what they actually do in their lives, it's all over the place. So I think just to me, I've always carried I carried this, my Islam, both deeply and lightly. I can't exactly explain that, but you know, I don't evaluate somebody's level of Islam by whether they do all 5 prayers. You know, it's sort of like recognizing that in Islamic countries, it's everything. So I just wanted to say that. Was that sort of your experience in all that traveling? Or?
For sure, if I could say a final thought about that.
Yes, please.
One of the things, so I grew up, I think like a lot of Americans, not just in an agnostic household, but just, so it was an agnostic household, but also like, you know, we didn't pay too much attention to religion. Like, I guess in the back of my mind, it was mildly obnoxious, but I didn't think about it a lot. So I didn't grow up like resenting religion per se. But so then, you know, in high school, you know, I started doing dhikr and, you know, so that, and also just reading and growing up. And so I became more open-minded in general. But one of the things that impressed me about all the people that I met when I first met Sidi and his students, and even today, thinking about my time at the Farm of Peace, like last year at Sufi school, is that I think it's so, I feel so grateful and privileged that there's people that come from so many different kinds of religious backgrounds and, you know, have different stories to tell about their spiritual journeys. And that, of course, affects how they relate to our tariqa. And so I find that there's this like endlessly fascinating conversations to have with people. This conversation is one of them. And yeah, I found that traveling throughout the world as well. And sometimes people, maybe they haven't heard the word Sufism or they associate it with like their weird uncle or whatever. But like Rahima says, you know, people have hearts and people care about each other, and in stereotypical ways, just like being impressed by the generosity of strangers has totally punctuated my world travels. And then one last thought is when I was in Egypt, I took place in this interfaith group, which was amazing for several reasons. So the Egyptian guy that ran it His parents were Iranian, and he was a convert to Baha'ism. And so that was already interesting. So he's like an Iranian Egyptian who's Baha'i, but you know, he's Egyptian, he speaks fluent Arabic, but you have these interfaith gatherings at his house. And so a lot of the Arabic students came, and so it was cool. So it was a combination, we were translating, and so it was intercultural translation, and there were Egyptians and Americans and some people that worked with the US Embassy. And so we're having this intercultural, interfaith dialogue at this guy's house in Egypt, just eating food and drinking tea and having fun. And so, yeah, I think that's part of my spiritual journey, and the things that I think of when I feel about connecting to this group is that it's kind of an unending chance to learn about each other and ourselves. And I'm just going to end on a super cheesy note and just roll with it. But that's what I feel. And as I reflect on being a part of this group and thinking about my kids and, you know, trying to have an open heart, yeah, the community and the open-heartedness and connection with people really stands out. And so thank you everyone for joining us in this group and
Abdur Rahman, Abdur Rahman, would you be okay to go a few minutes more?
Yeah. I can stick around.
Mastura asked a question in the chat. I'm going to ask that, and then Tamara has her hand up.
Sure.
You'll be the final question for today, Tamara. So we'll get to you. So Mastura asks, Sidi said, "At the heart of all religions is one religion. Also, if everyone knew their religion well, there would only be one. I'm curious about how closely related you find non-Islamic Sufis to the mystical sects of other religions or spiritualists."
Yeah, okay. So the first question, I think it's easy for a lot of us to agree with that like at the heart of all religions is the same thing. I think depending on your audience, that can get tricky too, because then you can tell a Christian, well, I believe in the same thing as you believe. And they're like, okay, I believe Jesus is God. You're like, okay, actually, I don't believe in the same thing, but I sort of do. And then they can be like, well, no, you don't, because I'm telling you what I believe. So don't tell me I believe what you believe. So I think, right, depending on who you're talking to, we can believe this in our heart, but can't necessarily have a material, logical conversation about it with people. So I think similarly with non-Islamic Sufis who might feel strongly that they do not need to practice any kind of formal relationship to 100% have a relationship with God and their spirituality. So, yeah, I mean, so I think it depends on audience, because I think a lot of us have the experience too of there are these traditional Islamic practices that are very powerful. And Ramadan, you know, if you can do it, if you can't do it, that's not a judgment. But if you do it and you have the experience of doing it, that can be a different kind of experience than just doing dhikr and like contemplating on what the inner fast might mean. And so I think part of it has to do with what people are open to as well. So sure, I think all religions can be the same at the heart, but certainly they look different in the way people practice and understand them.
And Tamara, go ahead and unmute yourself. You have the final question of the day.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Tamara.
Assalamu alaikum. It's Abdul Latif.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Congratulations on this beautiful effort that you've been able to bring light to. And mashallah, may Allah bless you and for all the hard work that you've been able to put out for us.
Ameen, and thank you.
I had one question, if I may. So with all of this academic pursuit, along with your experiential travels, how has your heart changed? How has your relationship to Allah changed, and your relationship to Sidi?
Well, geez, that's like another book. So, all right, how is my heart changed? So I'll try and give you a concise answer. As much as I make fun of myself for lacking concision, I can muster up the skill sometimes in teaching undergrads and, you know, needing to have something instead of nothing to say. I feel like I can do that as well. All right, so I want to make sure I know the 3 questions. I'll try and give you my best answer. So could you repeat them one more time? How has my heart changed?
How has your heart changed? How has your relationship to Allah changed? And your relationship with Sidi? with learning all of this academic information along with your travel and experience? How has that shaped you and changed your heart?
Sure. So I'm going to make an analogy. So someone once asked Houston Smith, who is a famous academic and also just like philosopher. He also wrote about Sufism, and he was one of the forerunners of psychedelic drug research in the 60s. And so someone asked him once, you know, Professor Smith, what would your life without ever having taken psychedelic drugs look like? And he said, like, I don't know. I don't have anything to compare it to. So that's my thinking about what it's like to be part of the path plus academia. These things have always been connected to each other. So on one level, I don't know. But at the same time, I've definitely been hyper conscious of it because I've been hanging out with members of the Tariqa, which are definitely not part of academia, members of academia who might have no interest in any kind of spiritual or social connection to Sufism, but might be super interested in reading old texts. So, I mean, it's been very much a back and forth weighing sort of, I mean, just the kinds of questions that are raised when what's the relationship between Sufism and Islam. So I would say it's really highlighted that question. What does it mean to look at something from the outside? What does it mean to look at it from the inside? And then also, I think this is an experience we have all the way. We have, a lot of us, is you can set out to look at something with a particular goal. Then there's all the experiences that happen to you, not by you, but to you along the way. And I would say that's a lot of it as well. And going back to the kinds of things Rahima has pointed out, that, yeah, just seeing that the world is full of beautiful people and also ugly people, but I think the beautiful people just tend to stand out more. And I try to have, you know, conversations with them as I think about what these questions mean. You know, I think about the heart question. Part of it is like, what does an open heart feel like to a, you know, 16-year-old high schooler kid versus, you know, someone in their late 30s who's gotten married and divorced and has kids. And so there's just the sheer force of life events that I think some of those I've mentioned, you can imagine those are going to affect how my heart might feel. And then also related, yeah, how I might feel to Allah and the community. And I'll say one more thing is that I'm very grateful to, you know, have things like Sufi school to go to occasionally, if not regularly. And I think thinking about the differences between like religion and spiritualities, people often like to make a distinction that religion's more community or rule oriented and spirituality is like more individual and free spirited. And I think that's true to a degree, but at the same time, when I reflect on what my spiritual life has meant, a lot of it is, yeah, closing my eyes and saying Allah, 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 you know, when no one else is around and having my own experience. But also it's, you know, eating, you know, lunch with people and, you know, talking to them about what's the difference between Islam and Sufism, and getting all sweaty sitting in the tent listening to, you know, Sidi talk and, you know, send us all into the fire and burning our nafs and feeling very uncomfortable. And so that doesn't happen without community. So yeah, so community remains very important. And, you know, that I don't, yeah, living kind of far away from community versus living at the land full of community with weekly dhikr is a different experience. But also, you know, this is the last thing I'll say. I'll just end on, you know, how I think about love as the driving force in what my heart is and how it connects to God is I have two lovely daughters and I live with them half time, and I've made a really wonderful group of friends in the area who are mostly academics, but, you know, in my case, they're super open-minded and are interested in different kinds of cultures and conversations, and we all sort of have this common human experience. So, you know, and there's y'all, and I go to Sufi school and stuff when I can. So yeah, continuing to connect with humans that I'm related to, that I'm not related to that are Sufi, that are non-Sufi, and finding this common experience of caring about people and love and social justice. And so these things remain important to my heart and my connection to God and community. And again, thank you all for being a part of this process and for inviting me.
And thank you.